Well, today I'm joined once again by my colleague Dan McCarthy, who is the editor of ISI's journal Modern Age and the vice president of our collegiate network.
Hi, Johnny. Great to join you.
Yeah, well, we've got quite the momentous occasion here. We are speaking the day after the presidential election, where Donald Trump and J.D. Vance won a historic victory. And it was truly a remarkable comeback for Donald Trump, a Nixonian-like comeback. With, I think, vast implications both politically, culturally, and conservative, and within the conservative movement as well. And you've written 3 pieces in the last 24 hours for a range of publications: The New York Times, The Spectator, The American Conservative, outlining the significance of this victory for the country. I'm just wanting to start things off, just if you could summarize where we're at right now.
Yeah, in the pages of the New York Times, I wrote about how this was a repudiation not only of Kamala Harris, it was not just a victory for Donald Trump, it was also a defeat for all of these forces of politics past that were supporting Kamala Harris. And that includes much of the mainstream media. Famously, one can argue about whether it includes the Washington Post and the LA Times, which of course did not endorse any candidate in this election. But certainly the writers at places like the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post and the editors were very much supportive of Kamala Harris, de facto, if not explicitly. And you had a number of prominent military figures from the intelligence community, Nobel laureates in economics, who would write open letters saying that Donald Trump's economic policies would be a disaster for the country. All of these things were highly publicized. The American people knew about all of these experts who had come out against Donald Trump. And yet, given the choice, the American people not only re-elected Donald Trump, they elected him by a wider margin than ever before, and they gave him a popular majority. So that really, the election wound up being a referendum on all of these establishment sources of authority. And it turned out that their authority, they're lacking legitimacy in the eyes of the public. It was a vote of no confidence in them. And Donald Trump, he's been given a big opportunity along with J.D. Vance. And the question now is what he's going to make of it. And then we can talk, if you want, about some of the other things I've written for the American Conservative and the Spectator. With the Spectator, I pointed out, remarkably, the democratic mindset about immigration and racial diversity, ethnic diversity, was that, as the country becomes more multicultural, as the country becomes less white, it will necessarily become more democratic and more progressive. And the wonderful thing about this election, one of the many wonderful things, is that it completely exploded that thesis, that you had a historic number of Latinos, especially Latino men, who chose to support Donald Trump. I think they're looking for opportunity, not for handouts. I think they are also, they come from a culture that is more Catholic. They come from a culture that has more traditional views of men and women. And when Kamala Harris and her very progressive supporters are going out there, and there seem to be supporters not only of transgenderism, but of all sorts of sort of innovations in the lives of men and women, I think a lot of Latinos saw that, as well as looking at the Biden-Harris economic record, and say, this is not only not what we want, it's the last thing we want. We much prefer Donald Trump.
Fascinating. I'm wondering, what do you think changed since 2022? Because in 2022, I had thought, I think similar to you at the time, that after the riots from the summer of 2020, after the COVID lockdowns, and then with inflation just kind of ripping, that there would be a major referendum on the Biden administration in the midterms, and that red wave that we were all expecting was more of a red trickle. While I was hopeful about this election, I also had some trepidation that there might be that backlash again. Has the change been, the fact that we've had 4 more years of the pain of inflation? Was it simply that they swapped Joe Biden for Kamala Harris and that she's less popular and less articulate as a spokesman for their views? Or is there something else going on? Is it that Donald Trump was at the top of the ticket in 24 where he wasn't in 22? What do you think caused this backlash now as opposed to 2 years ago?
Yeah, I think you caught the 2 most important elements there. One is, if Joe Biden were in fighting trim, if he were actually ready to go out on the field and play ball rather than being in a very decrepit condition, he might have been a more formidable opponent for Donald Trump than Kamala Harris proved to be. I still think Donald Trump would have won, but Biden has, even though he had long sought to become president and had failed time and time again in Democratic primaries, he was a battle-tested candidate. He was someone who had, paid his dues, proved that he had the mettle to endure, and to, ultimately to motivate voters to go out and support him. Kamala Harris, on the other hand, think about how untested she was. She never got as far as even the first primary in the Democratic primary season of 2020.
I still remember the glorious moment when Tulsi Gabbard took her out at that DNC debate.
That's right. Kamala Harris imploded in the primary campaign in 2020. And of course, she didn't compete in any open primaries, any primaries whatsoever this year either. It was, a smoke-filled room of, perhaps oligarchical billionaires and Nancy Pelosi and other leading Democrats. They decided that they were going to simply throw Joe Biden overboard. They were going to pressure him to drop out, and they were going to give the nomination to Kamala Harris. So I think Biden would have been more formidable, but I think that's not the whole story. And the other point you raise, namely that Donald Trump was at the top of the ticket, I think that's the most decisive element. And it's because, in some ways, America doesn't have two parties. It has three. And that's the Democrats, it's the Republicans, and then it's Donald Trump. And when you put the Republicans and Donald Trump together, that's going to win elections. Whereas in 2022, I think a lot of Trump voters didn't necessarily think of the Republican Party as their party, and they didn't go to the polls. They were not energetic. One of the best analyses I saw of this election before it happened in 2024, just a few days ago, said if you looked at the polling, it was very interesting because Republican candidates for the U.S. Senate were trailing Donald Trump in most of the polls. And it looked like the Republicans, they would probably get to 51 senators and control the Senate because of West Virginia. But it looked like they would have a hard time going beyond that. And these two analysts writing the Wall Street Journal said, actually, what's going to happen is this. Right now, a lot of Donald Trump voters are looking at these Senate races when they're polled, and they don't really feel invested in them. They don't feel invested in the Republican Party. They don't have any idea who these people are that are on these tickets. But they are invested in Donald Trump. And when it comes to Election Day, they're going to vote for Donald Trump, and then they're going to vote for all these other Republicans simply because they say they believe it will help Trump. And I think that proved to be exactly correct. So the Republicans have done very well. They've picked up, I think a net gain of about 3 Senate seats as of the time when we're recording this. So having Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, that energizes voters who otherwise would be very skeptical of the Republican Party.
Or who might not show up and vote at all.
Exactly. These are voters who, they never felt represented by Mitt Romney. They never felt represented by perhaps George W. Bush, but they do feel represented by Donald Trump. He speaks their language and they feel like he's on their side.
So as we look, well, I guess let's do a little bit more election analysis here. One thing that I think was a total game changer that we didn't really have any data on its impact until this election was the role that alternative and new media would play in shaping the outcome. I remember even just earlier this week kind of looking at Joe Rogan's endorsement, the interview that Joe Rogan did with Trump, which got over 50 million views. You see all these other characters, Theo Vaughn, Tucker Carlson, some of them conservative, some of them not conservative, but they have vast followings, and these videos are getting tens of millions of views. And I was really curious. This new audience, mostly probably disaffected young men who they were reaching. It was a question of whether they would actually turn out to the polls. Now, I don't know what percentage of those views translated into votes, but it struck me as kind of this is sort of the first election where I think there's really a referendum on the mainstream media in a way that it appears that the majority of Americans are no longer using them as their primary source of information. They have both their experience of living under the first 4 years of Trump and seeing what that was like, and then they have news that they're getting from other sources. So what do you think the role of these alternate voices was in shaping the outcome of the election?
Yeah, I had been skeptical of the role they would play to begin with, because in the past, appearing on podcasts didn't really seem to have much effect on election outcomes. But I think both Donald Trump and J.D. Vance going on Rogan and going on other podcasts and having extended conversations, in some cases running up to 3 hours or so, that showed a certain comfort in their own skin. It showed that they were not simply politicians reading off a teleprompter. You can't read off a teleprompter in a extemporal conversation with Joe Rogan for 3 hours, right? It really showed the spontaneity and humanity of Trump and Vance. And I think that made a huge difference. And you're right that these, especially Rogan's show, it has a vast audience. But this was an audience which really came away feeling as if I know something about Donald Trump now and J.D. Vance. I know something about who they are as people and how they're able to conduct themselves in a sort of free-ranging conversation. And I don't think anyone ever got that sense with Kamala Harris. I think people, even though she went on some of the large podcasts that have perhaps a more left-wing audience, or an audience that is even less conservative, one might say, than Joe Rogan. So I know she went on, Call Her Daddy, I think, is a podcast.
Even on that point, which, Call Her Daddy, which I know from looking at the Spotify charts, is, top 5 podcasts in the country. But, the views on that video with Kamala Harris were only in the 700,000s compared to 50 million. So it is. Yeah, it is. I had maybe thought that the influence of TikTok, particularly on young women with a lot of overwhelmingly pro-Kamala, pro-Democratic accounts, might have also, played to the Democrats' benefit in this analysis. But it appears that it wasn't quite as powerful as the more right of center kind of content.
You're right, and I think it's not just about the politics and the gender politics of these different podcasts, but also the depth and the substance that one's able to get from a long conversation that Trump and Vance were both having with their hosts. Whereas I get the impression that, we know that Kamala Harris was also invited on the Rogan show.
Sure. And
it never happened because she wanted to be a much briefer appearance. She wanted Rogan to come to her. It was all going to be very controlled. It was all going to be a typical sort of scripted political presentation, as opposed to the kind of freewheeling conversation that one could have with Trump or Vance. I think this is a huge transformation in the media landscape, not just because of the technology, but because of the technique. And there was a time when radio, and then later a time when television, both seemed to bring a kind of immediacy to politics, allowing people to hear the voice of someone who was running for office, which before was a very hard thing to experience. You had to actually go to a big rally, and maybe you could hear it in the sort of back of the crowd, but or see them in person and see them acting as if they were right here at a table having a conversation with you. That was really a dramatic form of connection that media provided people in the 20th century. But of course, now we take all of that for granted, and now it all seems very artificial. Everything that you see on television, everything, or almost everything perhaps, on radio, especially political radio, the format is well known. It doesn't hold any surprises. It doesn't seem natural. Whereas these podcasts, because they're so new, I think there's a naturalism to it that really creates a sense of authenticity behind figures like Vance and Trump, who are able to have a long, freewheeling, but sustained conversation with the host.
Yeah, and I think it's. Think back to just even previous elections. Imagine if one of the leading candidates was approached a week before the election and was asked, "Hey, would you sit down for a 3-hour interview, unscripted, with a host who historically has been more an independent-minded progressive, and you're just going to talk about anything, and he's irreverent and is going to drop F-bombs and he might push you to go in uncomfortable areas." I think most candidates would say, absolutely, that's sort of like would be a nightmare scenario.
I think that's right. I forget, forgive me if I'm getting the, details a little blurred, but I recall either George W. Bush or Dick Cheney did a couple of long radio chats with Rush Limbaugh back in the 2000s. And again, I forget the details. This may have been during election season, or this may actually have been outside of election season. But there have been instances where, yes, politicians would go and have a long, sustained conversation with a radio host. But even so, I think there was a degree of formality with, someone like George W. Bush appearing on Rush Limbaugh that you don't have when it's Joe Rogan talking to Donald Trump or J.D. Vance. Yeah. That's one of the things that probably is worth emphasizing here. People think of Trump as being, well, first of all, he's a media man himself. He's someone who built an empire with The Apprentice and other media appearances. And his way of communicating is obviously very off the cuff, to put it mildly. And so, people might think, well, of course, Donald Trump is nothing like a politician, but nobody else could do what he does.
Yeah.
I think that's a mistake because, in fact, J.D. Vance, who's quite disciplined as a politician in the traditional sense, also has this common touch and is also able to really come off as a real human being and someone who's engaging honestly and forthrightly with the questions being asked by someone like Rogan. That's a change in the way politicians are presenting themselves, and I think that's as important as the technological change.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, if you're kind of looking at, let's say, JD's vice presidential debate performance, where that's a very tight, scripted, in the sense of you have to be very disciplined, you're making tight arguments, you're tying it back to prosecuting the case against your opponent and then laying out your vision, to go from that to the 3-hour Rogan format. While I don't think Trump is kind of a singular personality when it comes to reality television, I think JD, had a tremendous degree of just being very down to earth, relatable. Felt like someone who you could just sit across the table with and have a beer and shoot the breeze, and like it would just be totally natural. And I think that's was a side of him that the mainstream media really didn't allow you to see, but I think that came out in a pretty big and important way in that interview for him. So thinking about the agenda, I mean, this is kind of really very, very unlike the last time Trump won, right? Where that time it took a number of people by surprise. Congress wasn't particularly on board with the overall agenda. So there's a lot of testing of that relationship between Paul Ryan and Donald Trump that needed to be figured out. This time, Congress is, very much on board, at least much more on board than they were 8 years ago. It looks like there'll be good majorities in both the House and the Senate. He has a popular mandate. So what are the top 2-3 things you think will get done in the first 2 years of the Trump administration?
There's obviously a very strong expectation that he's going to handle the immigration crisis. And that's not just about building a wall, although certainly I think his voters would be very happy to see that project proceed. But it's, you have to increase the number of apprehensions that are happening at the border. You have to reduce the incentives that are creating border crossings illegally in the first place. And you have to look at, and this is a phrase Mitt Romney got a lot of flack for using, but you have to look at what will encourage self-deportation. So when progressives want to scaremonger and when they want to create a sense of panic, to try to get people to vote against Donald Trump, they will, talk about, mass deportations as if, you're having huge squadrons of police go around and, check under the mattress of every private home looking for illegal immigrants. Nothing like that's going to happen. But rather, you're going to put more pressure on businesses. You may have, more, sort of efforts to make sure that businesses are verifying the identities of the people they're hiring. And if they aren't, then they can be sued, by the federal government and suffer severe penalties. That's going to make the businesses more likely to say to illegal immigrants, no, we will not hire you, which in turn is going to send a signal to the illegal immigrants, I should go back to my home country, or I should go to maybe Canada and get benefits in Canada rather than trying to get jobs and benefits in America. It's one of the things I think is very interesting is that when you have Americans, progressives who favor mass immigration to America, they always treat it as if, well, if you don't admit all these people to the United States, there's no place else they could possibly go. And actually, there are a lot of places that are more progressive than America.
Sure.
Send the immigration masses to other countries. And then if this level of immigration is really as beneficial as libertarians and progressives claim that it is, these other countries, will do so well that we'll want to imitate them and perhaps we'll want to have a more generous immigration policy ourselves. My suspicion is progressives and libertarians don't want to put that idea to the test because they realize it would not actually work out so well. And in fact, even Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada is now starting to crack down a little bit on immigration, simply because the problems that Canada has encountered are much too great. So immigration restriction is obviously a top priority. Another priority that Donald Trump will not be able to avoid, even if he wanted to, is the dual crisis, the two wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And Trump has said that he will have a path to peace in both of these conflicts, that he's going to bring much more skill as a negotiator to all parties of these conflicts. But he's coming into office in 2025, facing a much more volatile situation in the world than he did when he came into office in 2017. So it's going to be, I think, the first biggest test of Donald Trump's new presidency, how he can handle, the Ukraine crisis and also the war in the Middle East.
Yeah, I agree on both of those 2 points. Those seem like the you might say existential kind of challenges, and I think the immigration one, there's such broad support now for strengthening, reducing immigration from the things he laid out, whether it's building the wall, whether it's kind of reinstating the Remain in Mexico policy, whether it's adding more judges to adjudicate asylum cases, or even, I think probably the most effective of all of them would be having some form of e-verify, because that would immediately kind of encourage people who are not here legally to return to their home country or pursue life in another country. So I think some combination of those would more or less, I think, fix the situation pretty quickly. On the economy, I'm curious. You have I think a very interesting, unique opportunity here. Trying to get this economy going again. On one side you have I think deregulation will be coming. Some tariffs will be of order. At the same time, I think there's probably an opportunity to extend the tax cuts that were put into place the first time. And then there's, some very interesting, I think, collaboration where, if you were to ask me this just a few years ago, I would have said, you're crazy. But to think that the tech companies, and particularly these tech founders, from Elon to David Sachs to Bezos to Peter Thiel, they're sort of realigned with the Republican Party after they were, maybe not fully, maybe not perfectly, but they were demonized kind of as the bad guys a few years ago. And now I think there's the opportunity to kind of actually lean into American innovation and get the red tape out of the way, so that you really have technological innovation, tax cuts, economic growth merging with sort of economic patriotism that will make for a very interesting kind of economic platform and climate.
I agree. In some ways, it's both similar to and the opposite of the New Deal, because the New Deal also involved Franklin Roosevelt calling upon leaders of industry to come into his administration or to become part of his kitchen cabinet and to advise him on the creation of the New Deal. And of course, one libertarian and conservative critique of the New Deal has always been that, in fact, it restricted competition and favored, certain politically connected industries and captains of industry. Trump and the tech giants who've supported him, Elon Musk in particular, they have the potential to work together to create a more competitive environment, and one that has less of the kind of regulation that strangles new startups and that impedes the growth of businesses that are already starting to succeed but are being held back. So, and it's been very interesting to see the kind of coalition that has emerged on this issue. So it's not just Trump and Elon Musk and others of Elon Musk's sort of background as entrepreneurs. It's also Ron Paul has gotten in on the story.
Yeah.
So former Congressman Ron Paul, who is the by far the greatest libertarian statesman that America's produced in the last century. Ron Paul has been having discussions with Elon Musk on Twitter and perhaps also with Trump people about some of these regulatory and tech issues, but also about the Federal Reserve. And I think one has to tread very, very carefully here, because the criticisms of the Federal Reserve that Ron Paul or Vivek Ramaswamy and others level are broadly correct. But as a conservative, one looks at these institutions, even when they're extremely flawed, and says they have terrible, terrible deficiencies. But if you change them too quickly, you may disrupt people's expectations of how life is being led, and you just don't know where that's going to lead. And it could perhaps be, especially in the short term, a very wrenching kind of reorientation. But I think the Federal Reserve has to be audited. I think that's going to be something that Elon Musk and others will push for. And I think that's going to be a healthy thing. We need to have a look at what's happening with our monetary system, because that obviously directly connects with inflation and with a number of these other problems that Americans have been suffering under, not just in the past 4 years, but really as kind of an undercurrent in the whole sort of tech boom of the last 30-odd years. That when leftists complain about inequality, a lot of that inequality is the result of the monetary system making it very hard to be just a small-scale saver, to put money in a bank account and not have even 2% inflation gradually erode into nothing whatever small savings you're able to store away. While on the other hand, people who are able to take out massive loans at low interest rates from banks and other institutions, they can speculate with that money and then they can get the rewards. So that creates some of the inequality that in fact bothers the left a great deal. Reform of the monetary system could have enormous positive, but also potentially enormous negative effects on American life.
And as we think about the administrative state, I kind of think there's a little bit of a false dilemma that's being presented, where some people are saying we have to abolish the administrative state, others are saying we have to use it to conservative ends, and this has spurned all sorts of articles and kind of podcasts and debates on the right. At least the way I see it, I would say let's dismantle as much of the administrative state as possible, as feasible, as prudent to do. And then whatever remains, use it to the best of our abilities to promote ends that are conservative and pro-American and that support the American citizenry. So it seems to me like some of these battles are sort of presenting false dilemmas. I mean, similarly, I think you could say the same thing about the economic issues. Deregulation and tax cuts can live side by side with a more economic patriotism in terms of that environment. So I feel like there may be sort of the grounds for more of a new fusionism here than sort of a pitched existential war for either returning to kind of old school conservatism or something new entirely. So do you think there's a way that we can actually harmonize some of these poles?
Well, I do, and a lot of ideologues are simply inflexible. They don't want to think about trade-offs. They also don't want to think about alternative patterns. So if you consider something like free trade, for example, there are many libertarians who will defend free trade to the absolute maximum, while in the process of defending free trade, ignoring other things that in fact are taxes that are massively hurting the economy. So if you look historically, both in the United States and also in Britain, so the defeat of the Corn Laws in Britain under Robert Peel, who was kind of the first modern conservative prime minister, this is seen as being kind of the watershed in the division between classical liberals in the 19th century and conservatives in the 19th century. And even though Peel was himself the conservative leader, the Conservative Party splits as a result of the repeal of the Corn Laws, and the more protectionist element becomes the future of the Conservative Party with Benjamin Disraeli, whereas the anti-protectionists, including the Peelites, they start working with the more sort of radical and liberal elements in Parliament and become the Liberal Party. But what's interesting is that Peel not only repealed the Corn Laws, he also passed really the first permanent income tax in British history. And if you look at American history and British history, there's always been this trade-off between tariffs on the one hand and income taxes on the other. And one of the very interesting and in fact brilliant things that Trump said during the campaign was, hey, maybe we're going to finance the federal government with tariffs and not with any income tax.
Yeah.
Now that's the way we actually did it for most of American history in the 19th century. Now, whether the same thing would work today, because the federal government is certainly much larger, that's a good question. Maybe switching to this, tariff system rather than the income tax would actually be a force for constraining the growth of government, which is something that libertarians, of course, say that they're very strongly in favor of. And yet, this prejudice against tariffs, this prejudice against anything that obstructs free trade, is so powerful that many libertarians who otherwise would recognize, wait a minute, shrinking the government, constraining the government, limiting its sources of revenue, and abolishing the income tax. Hey, aren't all those things big wins for libertarianism? But a lot of libertarian ideologues, they don't want to admit that. On the other hand, I think real politicians who engage in transactions, they're capable of gauging the trade-offs much better, and they're more flexible. I think someone like Vivek Ramaswamy is a great example here. I mean, Vivek is much more libertarian than either J.D. Vance or Donald Trump himself. And yet Vivek is someone who understands that the things that Vivek wants to achieve have to be part of the package that J.D. Vance and Donald Trump represent. So you've got a great coalition here, and you're right, it is kind of a new fusionism.
Yeah, and I actually think maybe the thing that connects both camps is a sense of realism, right? They're not ideologues. And I actually think it's a pretty healthy spot to be in if you have, someone on one shoulder who's a stalwart protectionist and is talking to you all the time about manufacturing and protecting the middle class and kind of restoring that great sort of, even some of the nostalgia for mid-20th century America. Then you have someone else on your other shoulder who's saying like, but don't forget about innovation. Don't forget about the necessity of deregulation. Don't forget about pushing America to, go to the moon, go to Mars, kind of building on that legacy of innovation. As long as both of them are realists, they might not come down in the same place, but I'm actually very happy to have a voice on each shoulder reminding me of those two things. And then at the end of the day, there's going to be some balance that's struck. Some policies might fall more on the protectionist side. Some might favor sort of innovation and growth. But I'd much rather have that than to then have neither of those voices, or to have pure ideologues in both camps and not really being able to kind of,
That's right. The policies have to not only make sense in an intellectual way, which is one thing, they also have to work in the real world.
Sure.
And the ideologues, they have what they think are fully formed intellectual systems that are self-contained and sort of self-affirming. But these things often don't connect very well with the real world. And when they are attempted in the real world, they lead to disruptions and disasters. This, of course, also plays into questions about America's relationship with China, which will be another policy area that Trump and Vance will be introducing some innovations in. And there's been a fascinating conversation going on in Washington, D.C., and on Twitter as well, on X, between David Goldman on the one hand and a number of people who might be considered sort of China trade hawks on the other. And the China trade hawks say, we should not let Huawei buy any of our technology. We should, ban the export of American chips to China of any kind, not just, the most advanced that could be used in military applications. We don't even want China's commercial sector to do well with these chips. And David Goldman has a very interesting argument, which I think is largely correct, which says, actually, you're kind of reversing the logic of your own industrial policy if you do that, right? Because the logic of industrial policy says, you want to have strong, productive economies in your homeland. And if you have excessive amounts of free trade, what that does is it actually weakens the industries in your own country. Well, that obviously can be used, and this word sounds harsher than I really mean it, but that can be used offensively as well, right? So if we want China to be less of a threat to us, it would be great if they didn't have as many industries as they could have. And perhaps if they are reliant upon us for chips or for other things, that's going to actually weaken, it might be good for the, sort of bottom line of some of the companies in China, but it may in fact be bad for Chinese manufacturing prowess. So Goldman makes the argument that in fact, it's not these export bans that are the most important thing. It's rather the investment here in America in developing new technologies. And if we're not doing that, then our attempts to restrain China will fail, because if China is locked out of the global market for silicon chips, that just means China is going to develop a more robust manufacturing of these chips at home. And that's ultimately going to hurt us.
So another point that I think is worth discussing is the personnel. And, if you're comparing, the lay of the land in 2016, you and I were both working at the American Conservative when Trump won, and sort of the number of people in Washington that would have been perhaps supportive of that agenda were few and far between. Over the last 8 years, there's been a flourishing of probably at least a dozen organizations, especially staffed by younger kind of conservatives in DC, that are that share broadly kind of different facets of the agenda. So as you kind of look at the talent pipeline, but also the people that were around Trump, now versus then, if you think of kind of RFK and Tulsi Gabbard and Vivek and Tucker Carlson and JD Vance, the number of kind of people that are really committed kind of to the agenda, I think, has expanded significantly. So in one sense, it appears to me like there's an opportunity to actually have perhaps greater implementation of the agenda. On the other hand, I was listening to this podcast the other day where a rather controversial figure, Curtis Yarvin, it was a podcast, I believe, with the European Conservative, right? And so one criticism he offered of some of these staffing projects was essentially that these bureaucracies are so entrenched the number of people, even if you get 4,000 people that you can appoint, pales in comparison to the millions of people that actually work at these agencies. And so basically he was saying that all of these, well-intentioned staffing efforts are the equivalent of, parachuting in Marines into, Nazi-occupied Paris with squirt guns. You've trained them, they get the ideas, they're committed to liberty, they're going to get in with squirt guns, and what's going to happen is either they're going to just kind of become absorbed by the institutions they're trying to run, or in the worst case, what's going to happen is perhaps the president will tell one of them to fire a career bureaucrat or something, and they'll do it, and then there'll be a major legal battle that ensues, and basically the person who refuses to give the order will become a martyr for the cause of democracy, and so it'll be this endless series of kind of scapegoating people, but then also heroes emerging trying to stand up against Trump, and it'll all become very messy, and that these people are essentially going to their demise. So what do you make of that critique?
Well, that's just like any other necessary political battle.
Okay.
Think about the right to life battles. It was necessary to overturn Roe v. Wade, but overturning Roe v. Wade, predictably and in practice, led to a number of state battles, some of which have not gone favorably for pro-lifers. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that the overturning Roe v. Wade was a bad idea, and it doesn't mean that there's any way to get to a America that's fully supportive of unborn life, of babies in the womb, unless you actually go through all these difficulties step by step. It's the same with getting the federal bureaucracy under control. I'll say two things. First, I think this is another area where both the kind of new agenda of many of these young organizations and young individuals who have become very enthusiastic about Donald Trump and can supply the personnel necessary to fill the ranks. But as Yarvin says, they can only fill so many of these slots, maybe a couple thousand, but not the entire federal government. Nevertheless, that initiative now meshes very well with a much older initiative represented by our friend Donald Devine, for example, who worked for Ronald Reagan as his head of the Office of Personnel Management. This older initiative to try to completely cut the federal bureaucracy. So here again, in terms of the administrative state, you have to have both of these elements working together. You have to cut down as much as possible because otherwise the good people you have are going to be completely outnumbered. And then you also have to get those good people into the positions that really matter. And if both of these things work together, it doesn't mean you're going to have an easy course. It's still going to be much like the battles that the pro-life movement's encountering, but you're actually going to make some progress and headway. So there's just no substitute for actually encountering the enemy and going forward. By the way, I think you're right, and Curtis Yarvin is right. You will absolutely have these martyr stories, and we saw them during the first Trump administration. You will see them again, this time. However, Donald Trump has this clear popular mandate now, and just as Donald Trump went up against not only Kamala Harris but also Liz Cheney, also his own former chief of staff. He went against General Kelly, General Milley, and others. He went up against all these experts who said, all these authorities that expected the American people to trust them over Donald Trump, but actually the majority of the American people trusted Donald Trump. Similarly, I think the next time around, as these career bureaucrats get fired or disciplined by political appointees, I think Trump is actually in a position to win that battle, and that's what he needs to do. That's one of the key things. He has to look at these, personnel decisions in the same way and being as high stakes as the campaign itself. And he has to go into it with a, November 5th mentality.
I think one thing that people are tired of in America is sort of the existential nature of our politics. It feels like things are especially after this campaign. I think there's a sense in which people are wanting a return to normalcy. They're wanting a future where it's not just a pitched fight to the death between the right and the left. And I think it takes a truly exceptional leader to kind of be able to broker some settlement. I'm wondering, do you think it's possible? Some people would say it's not possible because they claim, both sides have it's that we don't agree on the same ends and we're arguing about the means, we're arguing about the ends themselves, right? And that kind of creates Some have described it as almost like a civil war-like scenario. I think one area where I'm optimistic is it seems like there's enough of a mandate now for some of these issues that Trump and Vance are talking about that actually maybe a majority of Americans do agree on the same ends, and it's just sort of out of touch elites that are they're the ones that we have the issue from. What I'm wondering is it possible, do you think, to actually reach a settlement either under this Trump administration or maybe in the years to come, where we're not in this existential gridlock forever, but we actually have, there's a solid majority that actually supports this new agenda, and there can actually be sort of a degree of peace and normalcy that's actually restored to American political discourse.
So there certainly is a good precedent for this, a good precedent for taking people who might conventionally be thought of as enemies and in fact making them friends. And as you've mentioned, RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, both of whom were Democrats, both of whom conservatives have had various criticisms of, but in fact they are part of this new Trump coalition,
Sure.
And they're not alone. So on the one hand, one doesn't want to sound like Pollyanna and say that the basic differences between left and right are going to be resolved, or that political rivalries are going to disappear, and that Democrats will not continue to see it as being in their interest to oppose Trump, even if they know Trump is right. Conflict will not be going away.
Sure.
But I think there is hope to reduce the tensions that have plagued our politics recently. You're right that Trump's popular majority is a key part of that. Democrats right now, I hope Democrats and progressives are looking at the results of the 2024 election and saying, this was certainly an affirmation of Donald Trump, but really it was a very damning indictment of us. That what we represent and what we've been doing is something the American public does not want. And so we have to think about what is it that Donald Trump does, that he stands for, that Americans like, that they don't like about us. And I think if that process takes place, you will start to find Democrats who in their own self-interest will perhaps want to work with the Trump administration. I think also a figure like J.D. Vance, looking into the future, I have to admit, during the vice presidential debate between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz, I was actually, as a conservative, I was a little frustrated that J.D. Vance didn't have more of the killer instinct. I wanted him to rip Walz to pieces because Vance, is met several standard deviations of IQ higher than Tim Walz, quite obviously. Vance didn't do that. Vance, in fact, had a very conciliatory tone throughout the debate. And, I, as a conservative, was a little frustrated with that. But afterwards, it proved that Vance was 100% correct. Because people who I thought would never, ever stop and consider, Vance as a good, decent human being, as anything other than a, implacable political enemy. I saw, left-wing journalists and, other figures basically saying, oh, I like J.D. Vance. Yeah. And, that doesn't mean I'm going to vote for the Trump-Vance ticket, but he came off as someone who, is lowering the temperature of politics. So Vance, I think, has that, and Trump has an opportunity to kind of set things up very nicely for Vance in 2028. So you can have this process whereby these old conflicts, which were really characterized as conflicts between basically these two very neoliberal, Clintonite and Bush, versions of the same kind of product. And, there's this old saying that it's the narcissism of small differences that makes for the most intense kind of conflicts. Sure. So when Democrats and Republicans are both in favor of a kind of hegemonic primacist foreign policy, when they're both in favor of relatively lax immigration policies, when they're both in favor of free trade, that's when they start to clash in ways that seem totally irreconcilable. Whereas in fact, once you actually put new issues on the table and a new configuration of politics out there, anyone who continues to hew to the old configuration is going to lose. And I think that's one of the key lessons of Trump's victory over Kamala Harris. Harris, as I say in my New York Times piece, she tried to combine all of the old elements in American politics. The Democratic Party, but also Cheney Republicans, and also all of these, sort of figures from yesteryear in terms of being generals who may have been presiding during the Afghan War, the Iraq War, journalists whose institutions were prestigious in the early to mid 20th century, and who today think they have the same degree of power they had in the 1950s. all of these sort of old guard forces were around Kamala Harris, and she thought, you know what, with this kind of coalition, I can't lose because all the authorities are on my side. And yet it turns out these are authorities that are antiquated. And the American public says the agenda you folks are talking about, which is, sort of permanent, perpetual expansion of NATO until, the entire planet is included in this, defensive alliance that becomes a world police organization, and the constant outsourcing of American jobs, economic, free trade policies that build up China while weakening the American Rust Belt. All of these things, the American people said, we don't want either the Republican or the Democratic variation of that, and we don't want the two variations put together into the Kamala Harris omnibus either.
Yeah.
We actually want the alternative that Donald Trump represents. So I think if Democrats don't start finding their own path towards that kind of alternative, they're going to be an obsolete party. And, maybe I think Bernie Sanders is too old to be someone who plays a pivotal role in that. But conceivably, elements, in the Sanders wing of the party could think their way through to re-examining the way politics and partisan divides work in the late 2020s and beyond.
And shifting a little bit to ISI in particular, ISI, in one sense, what happens in the world of politics certainly greatly impacts ISI's alumni, many of whom are, had very successful careers in politics and who even helped to staff the Reagan administration. In another sense, ISI's fundamental mission doesn't change. It wouldn't have changed whether Trump won or Harris won, because we're focused on the permanent things, really identifying and educating students in kind of the great Western tradition. But we also focus a lot on the conservative intellectual movement and tradition. And so I'm wondering what you think the impact is of this victory on intellectual conservatism. And one point I'll make before I give you a chance to respond is that the way in which Trump won, I think, has significantly kind of changed the conservative ecosystem. And what I mean by that is we didn't just have, 4 years of Trump and then he went away, right? We had 4 years of Trump followed by 4 years of Trump, but not him as president, right? And then now we're going to have 4 more years. So really the impact of Trump kind of on the conservative movement is 12 years, right? Which is unusual. We had 8 years of Bush and we got a lot of very Bush-flavored conservatism in those 8 years, but it was only 8 years. And then now with the pick of J.D. Vance being so young, being sort of a natural sort of heir to at least this movement moving forward, whether that's as a presidential candidate as himself or as a political figure of another type, you're potentially looking at, a 20-year period of time where a Trump-Vance kind of agenda could be impacting intellectual conservatism. How do you think that will change the movement? And what would you say to people who are perhaps more of the traditional fusionist or libertarian mindset who might be concerned about that new reality?
Yeah, I think it rejuvenates the movement and it adds life to it that otherwise was starting to slip away. Now, I do feel a high degree of sympathy and empathy for people who came of age in the 1970s and 1980s. People who are 20, 30 years older than I am, and who have really never left the year 1989. And I don't mean that in a sort of demeaning or insulting way. I mean, they said the formulas and political strategies and principles that worked in 1989 in terms of you not only had 2 terms of Reagan, but also Reagan's vice president was then going to become the next president. You had the Soviet Union, the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. The Soviet Union itself collapses in 1991. It seemed, Francis Fukuyama presents that as the end of history. But for a lot of conservatives, even before Fukuyama, it already was the end of history. We got all the answers to all the important questions. And even, there's even this sort of natural fusionism between small government conservatism or libertarianism on the one hand and social conservatism in this sense. If you shrank the government, all that would be left would be the traditional institutions of civil society, the families and the churches, the local communities of America. And so, these two things work together perfectly. As the government would shrink, you would have, stronger churches and stronger families. In the 21st century, we're facing a very different set of challenges. because a lot of those traditional institutions have eroded in the ensuing 40 years since the 1980s. And the question is, can they be rebuilt? They have to be rebuilt, but we don't have a perfect way of doing so. What kind of new institutions or arrangements must be made or must be added to the old ones? And also, how does the role of government play into these? Is government something that can sponsor these things, or is government going to be something that crowds out the kind of private initiatives that we need? These are fundamental questions that the conservative movement was asking before Reagan came on the scene. It was asking them during the Goldwater era and even earlier in the 1950s. These are questions that have to be renewed periodically by conservatives because they are fundamental to the process of American government, the process of being a free people, and trying to meet our challenges, both as a people who are free and therefore are independent of state control, but also as a people who do have a government apparatus for a reason. And that apparatus is meant to be serving the public, and serving not just the public as a sort of undifferentiated national mass, but rather serving our states and localities, which is a key point. And I think, by the way, one of the misunderstandings in right-wing politics at the moment is that a number of people see the label national conservatism, which our friend Yoram Hazony has promoted, and they say, well, okay, nationalism must mean the opposite of localism. It must mean the opposite of federalism. But that's exactly false. This kind of nationalism, certainly the kind of national conservatism that I would endorse, is an antidote to globalism. And it actually is a shield and a defense of localism, states' rights, and local communities, especially the economies of local communities and states. Because of course, if you have a local economy collapse, then you also are going to see the families collapse. You're probably going to see the churches change their character. The whole thing will come tumbling down. So, we have new problems now. I know that there are, old guard conservatives who are reluctant to look at a very changed environment and say it requires changed approaches, even if your principles, they differ in application, but they're the same at their root. But I'm encouraged because I think a lot of older conservatives, in fact, have come around to not just the Trump point of view, but rather this sort of more populist, more nationalist, more realistic appraisal of where America stands in the 21st century. I could name some names. I mean, there are some folks who are in their 80s and who were leaders of many major conservative institutions who are really they're aware of what went wrong during their own tenure of leadership. There are others who unfortunately don't have that awareness. But I think there's nostalgia can't get you very far, and America lives in the 2020s and beyond. And you can certainly object to Donald Trump. You can object to various policies that he might support, but you have to come to the table and you have to make your case anew. You can't simply pout, go off in a corner, and say this is not the way we would have done it when we thought we were Ronald Reagan. And of course, the real Reagan, as you and I have talked about before, was actually a much more complicated, much more realistic character than the ideologues portray him as being.
Yeah, and I think kind of seeing and understanding that there is actually continuity between where we're at, as the conservative intellectual movement now, and where it was at under Ronald Reagan, right? And that Reagan's leadership actually, I think, is informing a lot of the approach that our leaders have today. And then that also connects back to kind of the historic roots of the Republican Party that go all the way back to Abraham Lincoln and McKinley and many of the other, Calvin Coolidge, many of the other kind of favorites of conservatives. So I think we'll leave our conversation there. Thanks for joining, Dan, and look forward to seeing what unfolds in the days and months ahead.
Thanks, Johnny.